The chilly autumn air was crisp, biting at the edges of Elizabeth's coat as she stepped out of the small hospital where she had spent the last 12 hours tending to patients. The night had fallen swiftly, and the quiet of the late evening felt almost oppressive. Her head was heavy with exhaustion, but the familiar sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty street provided a strange sense of comfort. She was used to this, used to the quiet walk home after a grueling shift. Her mind wandered to the small apartment she shared with her father and younger brother. Her father had been out of work for months, and her brother was just starting high school. Money was tight, but they made do with what they had. Elizabeth had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But tonight, her thoughts were weighed down with a rare sense of uncertainty. It was hard to shake the thought that no matter how hard she worked, the future seemed uncertain. Her pace slowed as she approached the familiar stretch of road that led to her neighborhood. The streetlights, their glow soft and pale, illuminated the way ahead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The wind rustled through the trees, making a sound like whispered voices in the dark. Elizabeth pulled her coat tighter around her body, instinctively wrapping her arms around herself as the chill of early winter crept deeper into her bones. The quiet was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of traffic. But then, in an instant, everything changed. A sudden screech of tires echoed through the night, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal crashing into metal. The hair on the back of Elizabeth's neck stood on end, and her heart skipped a beat. She froze for a moment, her body instinctively tense, as the sound of a car smashing into something reverberated through the street. A deep, booming crash was followed by a hiss, something burning. Without thinking, Elizabeth's feet began to move. Her training as a nurse had kicked in, and her sense of urgency spurred her forward. She didn't stop to second-guess herself. The scene before her came into view as she rounded the corner. A car had flipped over on its side, and thick, acrid smoke poured out from the broken windows. The air smelled of gasoline, a sharp, biting stench that made her throat constrict. Her eyes scanned the scene quickly, assessing the situation. The car was a mess, its sleek, expensive body crumpled in a way that told her it had been traveling at high speed. But what caught her attention was the woman inside. She was frantically banging on the window, her face twisted in terror as she struggled to free herself. "Help me. Please, help me." The woman's voice cracked with fear, her face a mask of desperation. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She was already running toward the car, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, the heat from the engine seemed to intensify, the smoke thickening and swirling around her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She couldn't just stand there and watch. The woman's cries grew louder as Elizabeth reached the side of the car. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the urgency of the situation. The woman was trapped, her leg pinned between the seat and the crumpled dashboard. The car was rapidly filling with smoke, and with every passing second, the risk of an explosion seemed to grow. "Stay calm," Elizabeth called through the window, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. "I'll get you out of here." Elizabeth yanked on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She tried again, her muscles straining with the effort. Still nothing. The door was wedged shut. The impact of the crash had made it nearly impossible to open. The woman inside was screaming now, her voice a raw, desperate wail. "Please, my leg. I can't move it. Please, help me." Elizabeth's eyes scanned the area, looking for help. But the street was eerily silent. No one else was rushing to the scene. The few passers-by who had seen the accident had stopped, frozen in fear, their eyes wide with shock. But none were willing to risk their lives to help. A cold wave of frustration washed over Elizabeth, but she pushed it down. There was no time to waste. She had to act. With a deep breath, Elizabeth dropped to her knees and forced herself into a low crouch beside the car. The smoke was thick now, and it burned her eyes, but she didn't allow herself to be distracted. She looked at the woman's leg. It was badly trapped, twisted awkwardly between the seat and the dashboard. The woman was panting, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth didn't waste another second. She knew what she had to do. She slipped her arms under the woman's leg, trying her best to avoid causing further injury. The woman let out a sharp cry of pain as Elizabeth carefully maneuvered her leg free from the dashboard. With all the strength she had left, Elizabeth pulled the woman from the car, inch by agonizing inch. Her own muscles screamed in protest, but Elizabeth gritted her teeth and kept going. She couldn't stop now. The car could explode at any moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elizabeth managed to get the woman far enough away from the wreckage. She looked back just in time to see the first spark of flames lick at the underside of the car. There was no time to waste. "Stay with me," Elizabeth said, her voice steady as she helped the woman to her feet, though she was almost as exhausted as the woman herself. She could hear the whine of the engine in the distance, the threatening sound of something about to go horribly wrong. They staggered away from the wreckage, but Elizabeth knew they were still too close. The woman's weight was leaning heavily on her, but Elizabeth didn't dare stop. They had to get farther away, to safety. The hissing sound from the car's engine grew louder, more intense, as if the car was about to give way to a final, catastrophic explosion. Elizabeth didn't look back. Her eyes remained focused on the woman in front of her as she pulled her to safety. And then, just as they were a few meters away, it happened. A deafening explosion filled the night, sending a shockwave through the air. Flames erupted violently from the car, illuminating the night sky in an inferno of orange and red. Elizabeth threw herself in front of the woman, shielding her with her body as debris flew through the air. The heat was unbearable. Pain shot through Elizabeth's arm as she instinctively covered the woman with her own body. Her skin burned, but she didn't make a sound. Her only focus was keeping the woman safe. The woman clutched Elizabeth's hand, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she whispered, her voice breaking. But Elizabeth could barely hear her, the world around her spinning in a blur as her strength ran out. She could feel her body giving way, and her vision began to blur. But she didn't care. She had done what she came to do. She had saved a life. Before she lost consciousness, Elizabeth managed to whisper just one thing to the woman, her voice barely audible. "You're safe now." When Elizabeth finally regained consciousness, the first thing she felt was an unbearable pain in her arm. It was as if a fire had been set beneath her skin, every nerve screaming in protest at the injury. The air smelled sterile, clean, and antiseptic, but it was the harsh, bright light above her that startled her into full awareness. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, her mind still groggy from the haze of smoke and the shock of what had just happened. The sterile scent of the hospital, the soft beeping of monitors, the low hum of voices, everything felt far away, like she was still trapped in a dream. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the light, and she tried to sit up, but the moment she moved, a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her. She collapsed back onto the bed, groaning as the pain in her arm intensified. It was only then that she realized the bandages wrapped tightly around her right arm, which felt stiff and sore. A nurse entered the room, her face kind but concerned. "You're awake," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" Elizabeth winced, her gaze shifting to her arm, then to the nurse. "What happened?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You were brought in with a serious injury to your arm," the nurse explained. "It looks like you sustained burns from the explosion. Thankfully, you were able to get away in time. You were also exposed to a lot of smoke, but you seem stable now. You should rest, Elizabeth. You've been through a lot." Elizabeth's mind was racing. She remembered the accident, the fiery explosion, the woman trapped in the car. But there was something else, too. She could still feel the weight of the woman in her arms, the urgency of saving her. Her pulse quickened as she tried to sit up again, more urgently this time. "Where is she?" Elizabeth asked, panic creeping into her voice. "The woman, where is she?" Is she okay? The nurse gave her a reassuring smile. The woman is fine. She was treated for minor injuries, mostly bruising and shock. She's in recovery now. You're both lucky. Elizabeth let out a breath of relief, her shoulders relaxing slightly. But then the nurse's face grew more serious, and she leaned closer, lowering her voice as if she were about to share something important. Elizabeth, there's someone here who wants to speak with you, the nurse said. A man. He says he's very grateful for what you did, but he also insists on talking to you. He's waiting outside. Elizabeth frowned. She didn't know anyone who would be looking for her in a hospital at this hour. Her eyes darted toward the door, but she couldn't see anyone through the small crack. The nurse smiled warmly and stood up, gesturing to the hallway. I'll let him in now, the nurse said, her tone almost apologetic. You should prepare yourself. Before Elizabeth could respond, the nurse was gone, leaving the room quiet once again. Her mind was still reeling from the crash and the explosion, but now her thoughts swirled with uncertainty. Who would be visiting her? A stranger, someone who owed her gratitude. Seconds later, the door opened and a tall man stepped into the room, his presence commanding and unmistakable. He was impeccably dressed, wearing a tailored suit that looked expensive even in the dim light of the hospital room. His face was sharp, with strong features that exuded authority, but there was something in his eyes, a soft, almost vulnerable look that caught Elizabeth off guard. He stepped forward, his gaze softening when he saw her. Elizabeth, he said, his voice deep and smooth. Thank you. Thank you for saving my life. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She blinked, trying to process his words. Who are you? She asked, confusion and curiosity mixing in her voice. She had no idea who this man was, and yet his words seemed so earnest, so full of emotion. He smiled faintly, but there was a touch of something darker in his eyes. I'm Alexander Rivers, he said, holding up a hand as if it were meant to clarify something, though Elizabeth still had no idea who he was. I'm the man you pulled from the wreckage. The name Alexander Rivers seemed to trigger something in Elizabeth's memory, but it took her a moment to place it. When she did, her eyes widened. Alexander Rivers. The name had been in the news. The billionaire entrepreneur, one of the wealthiest men in the country. His name had been splashed across magazines, and his face had been plastered on the covers of financial publications. He was the founder of one of the largest tech companies in the world, a man known for his sharp business mind and ruthless drive. Elizabeth had heard of him, of course, but she never imagined she'd be face to face with him, much less saving his life. He seemed to sense her shock. I know this must be a lot to take in, Alexander continued, sitting down at the edge of her hospital bed, his eyes never leaving hers. But I owe you everything. If you hadn't acted so quickly, if you hadn't been there, I'd be dead right now. Elizabeth was still trying to process everything. The crash, the explosion, the woman, and now this man, a millionaire who seemed almost out of place in her world. It was surreal. I just did what anyone would have done, Elizabeth murmured, her voice shaking. I couldn't just stand there. It was the right thing to do. Alexander looked at her for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, without warning, he stood up. I disagree, he said firmly. You weren't just anyone. You risked your life to save mine. And for that, I'm grateful. More grateful than you can possibly understand. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart still racing. The room felt oddly heavy, as if the weight of the conversation was too much for her to bear. I'm not sure what to say, she began, feeling a strange mixture of humility and confusion. She had never imagined her life intersecting with someone like Alexander Rivers. To her, he seemed like a figure from a distant world, one she had no real connection to. Say yes, he said suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. Say yes to my offer. Let me help you. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. Help me? With what? I've been thinking a lot about this, about what you did. And I know I can't repay you for what you've done, but I can offer you something that might make things easier for you and your family," he said, his voice dropping slightly as if the weight of his words had just become heavier. "I want to offer you financial assistance. I want to help you with your future." Elizabeth shook her head, unable to process the offer. "I don't need charity," she said firmly. "I did what anyone would do." Alexander looked at her with a steady gaze, his expression unreadable. "This isn't charity," he said quietly. "This is an opportunity. An opportunity to change your life. An opportunity to make sure you and your family never have to worry about money again." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as his words settled in. She wanted to refuse, to deny his offer, and insist that she could handle things on her own. But then she thought of her father, struggling to find work, and her younger brother, still so full of potential but growing up in a world where opportunities were scarce. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Alexander paused for a long moment, his eyes darkening. "Because you saved me. Because you did something extraordinary when most people would have just walked away. You gave me a second chance at life, Elizabeth, and I'm offering you a chance at something more. Think about it. This could change everything for you." The silence between them stretched on, and Elizabeth's thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of doubt and possibility. She had always worked hard for everything she had. She had always believed that the only way to succeed was through sheer grit and determination. But here, in front of her, was an opportunity, an offer to change her life forever. Before she could respond, there was a knock on the door, and the nurse appeared, her face gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rivers," she said, "but visiting hours are over. You'll need to let Elizabeth rest." Alexander stood up, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's. "Think about what I've said," he urged. "I'll be in touch. You're not alone in this." As he left, Elizabeth sat there in stunned silence. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, the weight of his offer pressing heavily on her chest. She had saved his life, but now it seemed her own life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The days after the explosion felt like a blur to Elizabeth. Her body was healing, though the pain in her arm was still a constant reminder of the fire. But her mind was elsewhere. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames, heard the deafening explosion, and felt the weight of the woman she had pulled from the wreckage. That woman, whose name Elizabeth never even learned, had been saved, and that was all that mattered. But then there was Alexander Rivers. The memory of his visit to her hospital room haunted her. The man had offered her something she never could have imagined, an opportunity to change her life, to help her family, to lift the weight of financial struggle that had been pressing down on her for years. And yet, despite everything he had said, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface of his words. There was something about the way he looked at her, a depth in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made her wonder just how much he knew about her life. She had told herself over and over again that she didn't need his charity. She had always worked hard for everything she had. Her father had taught her that lesson from the time she was a child. Hard work, honesty, perseverance. Those were the things that mattered, not handouts. And yet, Alexander's offer had stirred something inside her. She couldn't deny that the prospect of financial stability, of never having to worry about her family's future again, was tempting. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to take that step. Elizabeth had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. But now, for the first time in her life, she found herself questioning everything she believed about herself. Was it worth it to accept the help of a man who was offering more than just money? Was there something more to this offer than simple gratitude? It was on the 3rd day after her release from the hospital that the phone call came. Elizabeth had just finished cleaning up her small apartment when the shrill ring of her phone cut through the quiet. She picked it up, still drying her hands on a towel, and glanced at the caller ID. The name that appeared made her heart skip a beat. Alexander Rivers. Her thumb hesitated over the green answer button. She hadn't expected him to call so soon, if at all. Maybe he was just following up, checking on her condition, making sure she was okay. But the thought that there was more to it, the thought that he might want something more from her, was a thought she couldn't shake. She took a deep breath, pressed the button, and brought the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but unsure. "Elizabeth." Alexander's voice came through the line, smooth and comforting. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," she replied, trying to sound casual, though her heart was racing. "I was just finishing up here." There was a brief pause before Alexander spoke again, his tone warm yet with an undercurrent of something more. "I wanted to check in with you. How's your arm? I know the doctor said you'd need time to heal." "It's getting better," Elizabeth said. "The pain's still there, but it's nothing I can't handle." "Good," he replied, his voice lingering as if he was unsure of how to continue. After a moment he added, "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other day, and I wanted to say again that I'm grateful for what you did. You saved my life, Elizabeth, and I can't thank you enough for that." Elizabeth's heart fluttered at his words, but she forced herself to stay focused. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what needed to be done." There was a short silence on the other end of the line, as if Alexander was considering her words carefully. Then, with a sigh, he spoke again, this time more firmly. "I understand that you may not be comfortable with my offer, but I want to make it clear that I'm not offering you money out of pity. This isn't charity. It's an opportunity. I've built an empire, Elizabeth, and I'm offering you a chance to join me in that. I believe you have potential I see in you that you may not even see in yourself." Elizabeth felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. His words were both flattering and overwhelming. She had always dreamed of something more, but never in a million years had she imagined that someone like Alexander Rivers would offer her a place in his world. A world of wealth, influence, and power. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quiet with disbelief. "Why are you offering this to me? I'm just a nurse. I'm just trying to make ends meet." "You're not just a nurse, Elizabeth," he said gently, as if speaking to someone who didn't understand her own worth. "You're someone who acted when others wouldn't. You didn't wait for someone else to step in. You took control of a dangerous situation and saved a life. That's rare. That's the kind of person I need around me. Someone who thinks fast, who acts without hesitation, and who has the heart to do the right thing." Elizabeth didn't know what to say. His words left her speechless, and for a moment she was simply overwhelmed by the gravity of what he was offering. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on earning everything she had worked for. But what if this was the opportunity that could change everything? What if this was the chance she had been waiting for, the chance to build a future that didn't involve scraping by? I don't know what to say," she finally murmured, her voice shaky. "It's just so much." "I understand," Alexander said softly, his tone reassuring. "There's no pressure, Elizabeth. Take your time. But know this, I'm here, and I'm willing to help you in ways that no one else can. And if you're ever ready, my door is always open." She could hear the sincerity in his voice, and for a brief moment she felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have the future she had always dreamed of. But then reality set in. There was no such thing as a free ride, was there? No one offered something for nothing. What was Alexander really asking of her? What was his true agenda? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface of his offer, something she hadn't yet discovered. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady now, though doubt gnawed at her insides. "Take all the time you need," he replied. "But remember, Elizabeth, this kind of opportunity doesn't come around often. When the time is right, you'll know what to do." The call ended with a click, and Elizabeth was left standing there, the phone pressed to her ear as the silence in her apartment enveloped her. Her mind raced, her thoughts bouncing between the possibilities that Alexander's offer presented and the uncertainty of what it might entail. What did she really want from her life? Was it enough to keep struggling, to keep working hard, but always wondering if she could have more? Or was it time to take a leap into the unknown, into the world of wealth and power that Alexander had hinted at? She wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. The decision ahead of her was bigger than anything she had ever faced before. The week that followed Alexander's call felt like an eternity to Elizabeth. Each day seemed to stretch longer than the last, and every waking moment was filled with the weight of the decision that loomed over her. She thought about his offer constantly, replaying their conversation over and over in her mind. It wasn't just the money or the financial security that had her questioning everything she knew. It was the possibilities. The world Alexander had described, his empire, his influence, the world of power and wealth, was far beyond anything she had ever imagined. And as much as she tried to convince herself that she could turn down such an opportunity, there was a part of her, deep down, that wondered what it would be like to live that life. Her father, when she had mentioned the offer, had been skeptical at best. "Don't trust people like that, Elizabeth," he had warned, his voice rough from years of hard labor. "People with money don't give it away unless they want something in return. No one does anything out of the goodness of their heart." Her father's cynicism was well-earned, she knew. He had worked his whole life in a factory, watching his body age faster than the years, while others, wealthy businessmen, investors, people like Alexander, seemed to rise above it all. Her father had never believed in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in handouts. Everything had to be earned, he had taught her. But Elizabeth wasn't her father. She had always believed in the possibility of something better, something more. She hadn't told him that Alexander had hinted at more than just financial help, that the billionaire had spoken of her potential, of her ability to contribute to something bigger than herself. That was the part that lingered with her most, the idea that Alexander saw something in her that no one else had, something beyond her current life as a nurse. She couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the intensity with which he had looked at her, as if he was sizing her up, but also as if he saw her in a way that even she hadn't seen herself. But still, something in her resisted. The old voice in her head, her father's voice, reminded her that nothing came for free, that there was always a price to pay. The question was, what was that price? And would she be willing to pay it? Elizabeth didn't have an answer yet. And so she did what she always did when faced with a decision she couldn't make. She buried herself in her work. The hospital shifts were long and exhausting, but they gave her something to focus on other than the whirlwind in her head. The familiar routines, the patients, the sterile halls, and the constant beeping of machines. Everything felt like a tether to the life she knew, the life that had defined her for so long. But even in the midst of the chaos, Alexander's voice kept echoing in her mind. His words, his promises, the undeniable magnetism in the way he had spoken to her. No matter how hard she tried to push them away, they kept coming back. It wasn't until the following Friday evening that she finally decided to face the decision head-on. She had just wrapped up a 12-hour shift and was heading home, her legs sore and her mind weary, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. "I think it's time to meet again. Dinner. Tomorrow evening. 7 p.m. I'll be waiting. Alexander." For a moment, Elizabeth's fingers hovered over the screen. A meeting. It was clear that Alexander was trying to nudge her toward a decision, but the fact that he had reached out again felt like a sign. She could continue to avoid him, continue to delay the inevitable, or she could finally face the opportunity that had been set before her. She texted back quickly, her hands trembling a little. "Okay, I'll be there." The moment she sent the message, a sense of finality washed over her. There was no turning back now. She had agreed to meet him, and in doing so, she had made her choice. Whether she realized it or not, she was about to step into a world that would change everything. The next evening, she stood before the mirror in her small apartment, staring at her reflection. She had changed into a simple yet elegant dress, something she had bought on a whim years ago, when she had dreamed of attending a fancy gala or high-end dinner party. She had never imagined actually wearing it, but now it felt like the right choice. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and glanced at the clock. She was cutting it close, but she had to get there. She didn't know what she would find when she met Alexander in person again, but she knew one thing for sure. This meeting would determine the course of her future. She grabbed her coat and walked out the door, locking it behind her. The drive to the restaurant felt like an eternity. The streets were dark, and the low hum of traffic seemed to match the beating of her heart. Every turn, every stoplight, every second felt like it was building up to something important. When she arrived at the restaurant, her breath caught in her throat. It was one of the finest dining establishments in the city, a place where the rich and powerful came to dine in private, away from the prying eyes of the public. The towering glass building glittered under the streetlights, and the valet greeted her with a polite smile, opening the door to let her inside. As she stepped through the threshold, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The polished floors, the rich, deep tones of the decor, the soft murmur of voices around her, all of it felt like another world, a world she had only read about in magazines. A hostess led her to a private room in the back, and as they approached, Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. There, at the center of a large round table, sat Alexander Rivers. His posture was confident, his eyes sharp, but as he saw her enter, his face softened into a warm smile. "Elizabeth," he greeted her, standing up as she approached. "I'm glad you came." She offered a tentative smile, trying to mask the anxiety swirling in her chest. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, sitting down at the table across from him. The waiter arrived moments later, and after ordering drinks, they were left alone. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like they were both waiting for the other to speak, for the moment to finally unfold. Elizabeth's fingers tapped nervously against the glass of water in front of her, her thoughts racing. After a long pause, Alexander finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Elizabeth, I've been thinking a lot about what I want to offer you, and I want you to know that this isn't just about money. It's about you, about your potential. You've got more in you than you realize." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of what he truly meant. "What do you want from me, Alexander?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't want to owe anyone, and I don't want to feel like I'm being used." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "I don't want anything from you, Elizabeth, not in the way you think. I'm offering you an opportunity to be part of something bigger, something that could change everything for you, and for the people you love. You've already proven that you have the heart to make a difference. I want you to be a part of something that makes a difference on a larger scale." Elizabeth swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. He was offering her a life she had never even imagined, and yet here it was, laid out before her. The decision she had been avoiding for so long was no longer just an abstract concept. It was real, and it was happening now. "You're offering me a new life," she whispered, the realization hitting her all at once. "But what's the cost?" Alexander's eyes never left hers. "The cost, Elizabeth, is your fear. It's the fear of stepping into the unknown, of letting go of everything you've known to embrace something greater. But I promise you, it's worth it." For a long moment, Elizabeth sat there, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do. But in the depths of her heart, she knew that this was a moment she couldn't ignore. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to step into the unknown. The days following her dinner with Alexander were a whirlwind. Elizabeth found herself caught in the current of emotions she didn't fully understand. Excitement, fear, uncertainty, and hope all tangled together in a way she couldn't untangle. That evening, she had left the restaurant with more questions than answers, yet something about Alexander's words had stuck with her. "The cost is your fear." As she sat at the small kitchen table of her apartment that night, the full weight of those words settled in. Fear. The thing that had always kept her rooted in place. The thing that had kept her working long hours at the hospital, scraping by month to month, fearing that if she reached for something more, she might fall. But was she ready to give it up? Was she ready to take that leap? Her father's voice echoed in her head. Don't trust people like him. They want something from you. His skepticism had always been a barrier, a defense against the overwhelming world of wealth and influence that loomed outside their small home. But this wasn't just about trust, was it? This was about the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to break free from everything that had held her back. She couldn't keep living this way. No more scraping by. No more worrying about whether there was enough money for rent or groceries. No more watching her father's health deteriorate as he worked himself into the ground. Alexander had seen something in her, something more than she had seen in herself, and even though she still didn't fully understand what he wanted from her, she couldn't ignore the feeling that this was her chance to change everything. The next day, Elizabeth woke early, the sunlight creeping through the blinds as she sat up in bed. Her mind was still heavy with thoughts, but one thing had become clear. She had to make a decision. She couldn't keep circling around the same questions, wondering what could be. She dressed quickly and left the apartment, the cool morning air biting at her skin. As she walked to her car, her thoughts drifted back to the previous week, when she had been unsure about taking Alexander's call, unsure about even meeting him for dinner. But now her path was clearer, the choice more definite. She arrived at the office building that housed Alexander's company. She had never been inside, never even seen the place up close. But as she stood at the entrance, she realized just how far out of her league she was. The towering skyscraper loomed above her, the glass windows reflecting the city's skyline. Everything about it screamed power, success, and ambition. It felt like stepping into a world that belonged to someone else. Elizabeth took a deep breath and entered through the revolving door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had already made the decision to accept Alexander's offer, but standing here now, in the heart of his world, it suddenly felt real. She was about to step into a new life, and she had no idea what that would mean for her. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, and within minutes, she was escorted to an elevator. The ride up was swift, the smooth hum of the elevator mingling with the rising tension in Elizabeth's chest. She had imagined what it would be like, but now that she was here, it felt surreal, like she was playing a part in someone else's story. When the doors opened, she stepped into a spacious lobby. The walls were lined with abstract art, and the polished floors gleamed under the soft lighting. It was beautiful, but it felt sterile, cold even. She followed the receptionist down a hallway, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence, until they reached a set of large double doors. "This is Mr. Rivers' office," the receptionist said, nodding at the door before turning to leave. Elizabeth stood there for a moment, her nerves crawling up her spine. This was it, the point of no return. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and knocked. "Come in." The voice on the other side was calm, commanding, and for some reason that made her more nervous. She turned the handle and stepped inside. Alexander was standing by the large window, looking out over the city. When he turned to face her, a warm smile spread across his face, and Elizabeth felt a momentary sense of reassurance. Despite the grandeur of the office and the wealth that surrounded her, his demeanor was kind, welcoming, even reassuring. "Elizabeth," he said, crossing the room to greet her, "I'm glad you came. Please, have a seat." She sat down in the chair opposite him, the nervous energy in her chest slowly settling into something more like anticipation. Alexander took his seat behind the sleek, modern desk, folding his hands in front of him. "You look well," he said, his eyes scanning her face as though assessing her. "How are you feeling about everything?" I'm still processing everything," Elizabeth replied honestly, her voice steady. "This is all so much more than I've ever imagined. But I'm ready. I think." He nodded, as though he had expected this response. "That's perfectly normal," he said with a reassuring smile. "It's a big step. And it won't be easy. But I believe in you, Elizabeth. I believe in what you can do." His confidence in her was almost overwhelming. No one had ever looked at her like this, like she was capable of more than she had ever dared to dream. Her heart swelled with a mix of pride and fear. "I appreciate your faith in me," she said softly. "But I still don't fully understand what this all means. What are you really offering me, Alexander? You've talked about potential, about a chance to be part of something big, but what exactly is that?" Elizabeth pushed the blankets off her legs and stood up, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She dressed quickly, her movements automatic as her mind raced ahead, planning for the day. She would meet with the team at the office, start familiarizing herself with the work, and hopefully get a sense of how she would contribute to this larger vision Alexander had promised. But deep down, Elizabeth knew that the hardest part wasn't going to be the work. It was going to be proving to herself that she belonged here, that she had what it took to thrive in a world so far removed from her own. By the time she arrived at the office building, her stomach was in knots, and the usual calm she had felt in her routine life had been replaced by a surge of adrenaline. As she walked through the polished lobby, past the gleaming marble floors and the towering glass walls, everything seemed surreal. The world around her felt like a dream she was only just starting to wake up from, but every step she took seemed to make it more and more real. The receptionist greeted her with a bright smile, and Elizabeth, still feeling a bit out of place, gave a tentative smile in return. "Mr. Rivers is expecting you. You'll be meeting with the senior team on the 15th floor," the receptionist said. Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't help but think back to the first time she had seen this building. The same sense of awe had filled her then, but it had been mixed with feelings of insecurity. Now she was entering it, not as an outsider, but as part of the world that had once seemed so foreign to her. The elevator ride up felt like a lifetime, the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm her nerves. She stood in front of the glass panels, watching the city zip past as the elevator ascended, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, she hardly recognized herself. She had never been one to stand out, to make waves. But now she was stepping into a life that demanded confidence, ambition, and drive. She wasn't sure if she had those things, but she was going to find out. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a sleek, modern space, walls of glass, smooth wooden floors, and the soft murmur of conversation coming from various corners of the floor. She followed a young woman, an assistant perhaps, down a hallway toward a set of large double doors. The closer she got, the more she could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Was she really ready for this? The doors opened, and she was ushered into a large conference room, where several people were already gathered. There was an immediate hush when she walked in. They were all dressed in sharp suits, their faces a mix of curiosity and appraisal. But when Alexander entered the room shortly after, his presence seemed to ease the tension. "Everyone, this is Elizabeth," Alexander said, his voice commanding but not unkind. "She's going to be joining us today as part of the strategy team. Elizabeth, meet the rest of the senior team." The introductions came quickly. There was Michael, the head of operations, a no-nonsense kind of guy with sharp eyes and a deep voice. Samantha, the marketing director, who greeted Elizabeth warmly but with a professional smile. And Carlos, the financial strategist, who gave her a polite handshake but didn't seem too interested in getting to know her just yet. Elizabeth could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but Alexander's reassuring presence helped calm her nerves. As the meeting began, Alexander outlined the vision of the company, explaining how their mission wasn't just to grow wealth, but to create lasting social change through strategic investments and community-driven initiatives. It was everything Elizabeth had hoped for when she had made the decision to join, an opportunity to do something that mattered. But the gravity of it all was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a job. This was a calling, a responsibility she hadn't fully anticipated. The team discussed several ongoing projects, and as the meeting progressed, Elizabeth found herself tuning in, her mind absorbing every detail. She had always been good at thinking on her feet, and the knowledge she had gained in her nursing career, understanding people, working under pressure, multitasking, seemed to have prepared her for moments like this. When Alexander turned to her and asked her opinion on a particular initiative, her heart skipped a beat, but she spoke up confidently, offering suggestions that drew appreciative nods from the team. For the first time in a long while, she felt like her voice mattered. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was part of something bigger. The meeting lasted for hours, and by the time they broke for lunch, Elizabeth was mentally exhausted but exhilarated. She could see the way the team operated, how they worked together, how they pushed each other to be better. It was a world that demanded excellence, and Elizabeth was beginning to see that she had a lot more to offer than she had ever believed. But as the day wore on, something else began to gnaw at her. The deeper she got into the projects, the more she realized how much she had to learn. The financial jargon, the long-term strategies, the complexities of the company's global reach, it was overwhelming. It was one thing to believe in the vision, but it was another thing to fully understand how it all fit together. She began to doubt herself, the familiar insecurity creeping back in. What had she gotten herself into? She was just a nurse after all. How was she supposed to contribute to something so much larger than herself? She wasn't equipped for this world. By the time the end of the day arrived, Elizabeth was exhausted. She had done her best to keep up, to prove that she belonged, but the fear of failure was starting to take hold. As she sat in the back of the car on her ride home, she found herself questioning everything. She had thought she was ready, but now, the magnitude of her choice seemed almost too much to bear. As the car pulled up to her apartment building, Elizabeth's phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "You did well today. I know this is a lot, but remember, you belong here. Trust yourself." His words, simple yet direct, calmed her nerves for a moment. He believed in her, and somehow she had to start believing in herself. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Elizabeth realized that the path ahead would never be easy. It would require every ounce of strength she had, and more. But for the first time, she felt the stirrings of something greater within her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just a girl from a small apartment, from a world that seemed so far away from this one. She was part of something now, and whether she was ready or not, she was going to rise to the challenge. Her journey was just beginning. Elizabeth pushed the blankets off her legs and stood up, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She dressed quickly, her movements automatic as her mind raced ahead, planning for the day. She would meet with the team at the office, start familiarizing herself with the work, and hopefully get a sense of how she would contribute to this larger vision Alexander had promised. But deep down, Elizabeth knew that the hardest part wasn't going to be the work. It was going to be proving to herself that she belonged here, that she had what it took to thrive in a world so far removed from her own. By the time she arrived at the office building, her stomach was in knots, and the usual calm she had felt in her routine life had been replaced by a surge of adrenaline. As she walked through the polished lobby, past the gleaming marble floors and the towering glass walls, everything seemed surreal. The world around her felt like a dream she was only just starting to wake up from, but every step she took seemed to make it more and more real. The receptionist greeted her with a bright smile, and Elizabeth, still feeling a bit out of place, gave a tentative smile in return. "Mr. Rivers is expecting you. You'll be meeting with the senior team on the 15th floor," the receptionist said. Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't help but think back to the first time she had seen this building. The same sense of awe had filled her then, but it had been mixed with feelings of insecurity. Now she was entering it, not as an outsider, but as part of the world that had once seemed so foreign to her. The elevator ride up felt like a lifetime. the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm her nerves. She stood in front of the glass panels, watching the city zip past as the elevator ascended, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, she hardly recognized herself. She had never been one to stand out, to make waves. But now she was stepping into a life that demanded confidence, ambition, and drive. She wasn't sure if she had those things, but she was going to find out. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a sleek, modern space. Walls of glass, smooth wooden floors, and the soft murmur of conversation coming from various corners of the floor. She followed a young woman, an assistant perhaps, down a hallway toward a set of large double doors. The closer she got, the more she could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Was she really ready for this? The doors opened, and she was ushered into a large conference room, where several people were already gathered. There was an immediate hush when she walked in. They were all dressed in sharp suits, their faces a mix of curiosity and appraisal. But when Alexander entered the room shortly after, his presence seemed to ease the tension. "Everyone, this is Elizabeth," Alexander said, his voice commanding but not unkind. "She's going to be joining us today as part of the strategy team. Elizabeth, meet the rest of the senior team." The introductions came quickly. There was Michael, the head of operations, a no-nonsense kind of guy with sharp eyes and a deep voice. Samantha, the marketing director, who greeted Elizabeth warmly but with a professional smile. And Carlos, the financial strategist, who gave her a polite handshake but didn't seem too interested in getting to know her just yet. Elizabeth could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but Alexander's reassuring presence helped calm her nerves. As the meeting began, Alexander outlined the vision of the company, explaining how their mission wasn't just to grow wealth, but to create lasting social change through strategic investments and community-driven initiatives. It was everything Elizabeth had hoped for when she had made the decision to join, an opportunity to do something that mattered. But the gravity of it all was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a job. This was a calling, a responsibility she hadn't fully anticipated. The team discussed several ongoing projects, and as the meeting progressed, Elizabeth found herself tuning in, her mind absorbing every detail. She had always been good at thinking on her feet, and the knowledge she had gained in her nursing career, understanding people, working under pressure, multitasking, seemed to have prepared her for moments like this. When Alexander turned to her and asked her opinion on a particular initiative, her heart skipped a beat, but she spoke up confidently, offering suggestions that drew appreciative nods from the team. For the first time in a long while, she felt like her voice mattered. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was part of something bigger,